Here's the uncomfortable truth that no one talks about in professional development seminars. The people who hurt us most deeply are often the ones we trust completely. Our colleagues, our workplace confidants, the people we see more than our own families. We build our professional lives on the foundation of trust, believing that shared deadlines, coffee breaks, and workplace struggles create bonds that transcend the usual boundaries of competition and self-interest. Yet paradoxically, it's precisely these environments where we're most vulnerable to betrayal, where loyalty becomes a weapon turned against us, and where our genuine emotions become entertainment for others who never took us seriously in the first place. The morning shift at Henderson's Bakery had always been Marcus's sanctuary, where flour dust danced in the early sunlight, and the rhythm of kneading dough provided a meditation that corporate boardrooms could never offer. For 3 years, he'd arrived at 4:30 a.m. sharp, long before the pastry team or front-of-house staff, crafting his artisanal loaves with the dedication of a monk tending his garden. The professional environment had become his second home, built on the foundation of trust between colleagues who shared the sacred ritual of feeding their community. But sometimes, the most profound betrayals bloom in the places where we feel safest, where loyalty seems as natural as breathing. The heart, unfortunately, doesn't recognize the boundaries of workplace professionalism, and when it decides to speak, it often chooses the most inconvenient moments. Marcus discovered this truth when Sarah joined the team, bringing with her a smile that could make even burnt croissants seem like masterpieces. Her presence transformed his solitary morning routine into something he'd never experienced before, anticipation mixed with the nervous energy of possibility. The first poem appeared on a Tuesday, written on a napkin, and carefully placed beside Sarah's coffee station. Marcus had wrestled with the decision for weeks, his practical mind warning him about the complications of workplace romance, while his heart insisted that some feelings demand expression, regardless of the setting. The verse was simple, nothing that would win literary awards, but it carried the weight of genuine emotion. Morning light through window panes reminds me why I love these lanes of flour, sugar, hope, and dreams. You make it more than what it seems. He'd arrived 20 minutes earlier than usual, his hands trembling slightly as he positioned the note, wondering if he was crossing a line that would forever change the delicate balance of their professional relationship. The trust he'd built in this environment felt simultaneously fragile and essential, like a souffle that could collapse with the slightest disturbance. Yet something deeper than professional caution was driving him forward, a voice that whispered about chances not taken and words left unspoken. The learning process of understanding his own heart had begun, though he didn't yet realize how painful the curriculum would prove to be. Sarah's reaction exceeded his wildest expectations, her face lighting up with genuine delight as she read his words aloud to herself, unconsciously bringing her hand to her chest in a gesture that spoke of pleasant surprise. "You should publish these things," she told him during their brief interaction at the prep station, her voice carrying that musical quality that had first caught his attention. "They make the day start lighter." The encouragement felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, validating not just his amateur poetry, but the risk he'd taken in sharing something so personal within their professional sphere. Marcus found himself walking taller, working with renewed energy, as if her words had unlocked some hidden reservoir of confidence he'd never known existed. The frustration of his previous failed attempts at connection, awkward conversations that died in uncomfortable silences, seemed to dissolve in the warmth of her appreciation. For the first time in months, the prospect of each new workday filled him with excitement rather than mere routine. But as any experienced baker knows, the most beautiful rises often precede the most devastating falls, and Marcus was about to learn that lesson in ways that would forever change his understanding of trust and disappointment. The coffee breaks became Marcus's favorite part of each shift, those precious 15-minute windows when professional obligations softened into something more personal and intimate. He'd find himself rehearsing conversations in his head, planning witty observations about the day's challenges, or thoughtful questions about Sarah's aspirations beyond the bakery walls. Yet invariably, when the moment arrived, his carefully prepared words would scatter like flour in a strong wind, leaving him stammering through nervous small talk that felt nothing like the confident man he imagined himself to be. Sarah, with the grace that seemed to define her every interaction, would listen patiently to his fumbling attempts at conversation, her eyes kind and her responses gentle. "I think it's adorable how you get nervous," she'd say, reaching across the small break room table to briefly touch his hand, sending electricity through his entire nervous system. These moments felt like victories, small confirmations that his feelings might not be entirely one-sided, that the connection he sensed growing between them had roots in reality rather than wishful thinking. The professional environment that had once felt so structured and predictable was transforming into something more complex, more human, more alive with possibility. Marcus began to see their workplace through different eyes, noticing details that had previously escaped his attention. The way Sarah hummed while decorating cakes, how she always saved the corner pieces of failed batches for the stray cat that visited their loading dock, her habit of leaving encouraging notes for the evening cleaning crew. The trust he felt in their growing connection seemed to mirror the broader sense of loyalty that defined Henderson's Bakery, where colleagues supported each other through busy holiday rushes and personal crises alike. He started arriving even earlier, not just to write poems, but to ensure the coffee was perfectly brewed when Sarah arrived, that her workstation was clean and organized, that every small gesture might communicate what his nervous tongue couldn't quite articulate. The learning curve of workplace romance felt manageable, even enjoyable, as long as it was progressing in the right direction. His frustration with his own shyness began to fade, replaced by patience and the understanding that good things, like perfectly risen bread, require time and gentle care. The anticipation of each new day had become a source of energy rather than anxiety, and Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was on the verge of something wonderful. But life has a way of teaching us that our most cherished assumptions can shatter in an instant, like dropping a tray of delicate pastries on an unforgiving floor. The morning that would change everything started like any other, with Marcus arriving in darkness, key turning in the familiar lock, overhead lights flickering to life across the empty bakery. He'd written what he considered his best poem yet, words that came from someplace deeper than his usual observations, verses that spoke of connection and possibility, and the way certain people can transform ordinary moments into something magical. The anticipation thrummed through him as he moved through his opening routine, preparing the ovens, checking inventory, laying out the tools that would shape another day of creation. He was 20 minutes ahead of schedule, giving him extra time to perfect the placement of his note, to ensure that Sarah's first moment of the day would be touched by his words. The professional environment felt charged with potential, as if the very air was conspiring to support his romantic endeavors. Little did he know that he was about to receive a masterclass in the difference between perception and reality, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truths that exist independent of our hopes. The scene that greeted him as he rounded the corner toward the pastry station would replay in his mind for weeks afterward, each detail etched with the clarity that comes from shock and disappointment. Sarah was already there, leaning against the prep counter with an ease that spoke of comfort and familiarity, her laugh ringing through the quiet space like music he'd never heard before. But she wasn't alone. David, the head pastry chef, stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched, his hand resting casually on her arm, as he whispered something that made her eyes sparkle with delight. The intimacy of the moment was unmistakable, the kind of natural chemistry that couldn't be manufactured or forced, the connection that Marcus had hoped was developing between him and Sarah but was clearly flourishing elsewhere. The betrayal wasn't dramatic or malicious. There had been no promises broken, no explicit commitments violated, yet it cut through him with the precision of a baker's blade, swift and clean and devastatingly effective. In that frozen moment, Marcus understood that all his careful poems, all his nervous conversations, all his hopeful interpretations of her kindness had been built on a foundation of wishful thinking rather than mutual interest. The learning process he'd thought was about romance was actually about the harder lesson of recognizing when our feelings aren't reciprocated, when the trust we place in our own perceptions leads us astray. Sarah's words had felt like a benediction, a validation that transformed Marcus's amateur verses from embarrassing scribbles into something worthy of acknowledgement and praise. "You should publish these things," They make the day start lighter. The encouragement rang in his ears long after she'd spoken it, replaying during his solitary drive home, echoing through his evening routine, providing the soundtrack to dreams that painted rosy pictures of literary success and romantic fulfillment. The professional environment of Henderson's Bakery, where feedback usually came in the form of customer complaints or health inspector notes, her words felt like discovering a hidden treasure in the most ordinary of places. The trust he placed in her sincerity seemed as solid as the foundation of the building itself, unshakable and permanent. Marcus had never considered himself a writer, had never imagined that his scattered thoughts about sunrise and flower and the simple beauty of honest work could resonate with another human being. Her response awakened something dormant within him, a creative confidence that began to reshape how he saw himself and his place in the world. The learning process of believing in his own artistic voice had begun, though he would soon discover how quickly external validation can be revealed as mere politeness. The morning conversations took on new dimensions, as Marcus began to see Sarah not just as the object of his romantic interest, but as his first real audience. His critic and champion rolled into one encouraging package. He'd catch himself crafting mental notes throughout the day, observing the way steam rose from fresh bread, or how afternoon light transformed the bakery's atmosphere, already planning how to capture these moments in verse for her morning reading. The frustration of his tongue-tied nature began to fade as he found his voice through written words, each poem becoming a small act of courage that pushed against the boundaries of his usual reserved demeanor. Sarah's consistent positive responses, her smile when discovering each new note, her brief comments about favorite lines, her general enthusiasm for his creative efforts, built a momentum that felt sustainable and real. The professional environment that had once intimidated him with its social complexities now felt like fertile ground for artistic expression and personal growth. He began to imagine scenarios where his poetry might extend beyond their workplace, where Sarah's encouragement might lead to broader recognition, where the connection he felt through his verses might blossom into something deeper and more lasting. The disappointment he'd experienced in previous romantic endeavors seemed like ancient history compared to this new chapter of mutual appreciation and creative collaboration. Marcus started researching local poetry readings, browsing submission guidelines for literary magazines, even sketching plans for a small chapbook that might capture the essence of his bakery-inspired verses. Sarah's suggestion about publication had planted a seed that grew with each passing day, transforming from a casual compliment into what felt like a concrete goal worth pursuing. The loyalty he felt toward her opinion became the driving force behind his creative ambitions, her words carrying more weight than any professor's feedback or critic's review could possibly possess. He began to see patterns in which poems she responded to most enthusiastically, adjusting his style to match what seemed to resonate with her aesthetic sensibilities. The trust he placed in her judgment felt like the foundation of a larger artistic journey, one that might eventually lead him away from the pre-dawn world of bread making and into something more aligned with his newly discovered creative identity. The anticipation of her daily reactions became as important as the writing itself, each poem serving as both artistic expression and romantic gesture, two purposes that seemed to complement and strengthen each other. But the most painful lessons often come disguised as our greatest encouragements, and Marcus was about to learn that kind words don't always carry the weight we assign to them. The routine had become sacred. Arrive early, brew perfect coffee, position the day's poem with careful precision, wait for Sarah's arrival with the nervous excitement of an opening night performer. Marcus had developed an intuitive sense of timing, knowing exactly when to position himself within earshot, but not so close as to seem intrusive, allowing Sarah the privacy to discover and read his words while still being present for her inevitable positive response. Her appreciation had become the fuel that powered his creative engine, the external validation that transformed his early morning solitude from lonely dedication into purposeful preparation for connection. The professional environment had evolved into something more personal and intimate, a space where artistic expression and romantic possibility intersected in ways that felt both natural and revolutionary. Marcus began to believe that he'd found not just a romantic interest, but a creative partner, who understood and valued his artistic voice in ways that no one else had ever bothered to explore. The learning curve of balancing professional responsibilities with personal expression had smoothed into a comfortable rhythm, each day building upon the foundation of the previous one. Her encouragement had become the lighthouse guiding his creative ship through previously uncharted waters, steady and reliable, and seemingly permanent. The morning that shattered his illusions started with his most ambitious poem yet, verses that wove together themes of artistic partnership, mutual inspiration, and the possibility of love growing from shared creative appreciation. Marcus had spent hours crafting the piece, revising lines, testing rhythms, ensuring that every word carried the weight of his deepest feelings while maintaining the accessible charm that Sarah seemed to appreciate. The trust he placed in her continued enthusiasm felt unshakable as he positioned the note beside her coffee station, his hands steady with confidence, born from weeks of positive reinforcement. He'd even included a subtle reference to her suggestion about publication, weaving her encouragement into the poem's fabric as both inspiration and dedication. The professional environment buzzed with its usual pre-opening energy, but Marcus moved through his routine with unusual calm, secure in the knowledge that his creative efforts would once again be met with appreciation and support. The frustration of his previous romantic failures felt like distant memories, replaced by the steady satisfaction of artistic growth and the promise of deeper connection. But sometimes the most devastating revelations come not through dramatic confrontations, but through the simple act of overhearing conversations we were never meant to witness. The break room door was slightly ajar, and Marcus approached with his usual coffee refill routine, his mind still partially occupied with mental revisions to tomorrow's potential poem. The voices inside were familiar, Sarah's musical laughter mixing with David's deeper tones, but the words they spoke would forever change Marcus's understanding of encouragement, sincerity, and the difference between politeness and genuine interest. "The poor guy thinks he's the next Shakespeare," David was saying, his tone carrying the casual cruelty that comes from discussing someone you don't expect to overhear. Sarah's response cut even deeper. "I know, but what am I supposed to say? They're terrible, but he tries so hard. I just tell him they're good because it seems mean to crush his little hobby." The conversation continued, each word landing like a physical blow. But Marcus had heard enough to understand that every encouragement, every smile, every positive response had been nothing more than professional courtesy, masquerading as genuine appreciation. The betrayal wasn't in Sarah's lack of romantic interest, that he could have accepted and moved past, but in the realization that his trust in her honesty had been completely misplaced. The learning process he'd embraced so enthusiastically had been built on a foundation of pity rather than authentic connection, his artistic growth nurtured by lies rather than truth. The disappointment that washed over him was different from romantic rejection. It was the deeper pain of discovering that his creative voice, which had felt so validated and encouraged, had been nothing more than an object of condescending amusement. The aftermath of that overheard conversation would reshape Marcus's understanding of trust, encouragement, and the complex dynamics that exist within professional environments, where personal feelings intersect with workplace politeness. The poem stopped appearing beside Sarah's coffee station, not from anger or dramatic gesture, but from the simple recognition that continuing would mean participating in a charade that had already caused him enough pain. Sarah's eventual question, "Where are my morning poems?" would be met with a response that balanced honesty with dignity, protecting both his wounded pride and their professional relationship. The loyalty he'd felt toward her opinion had been replaced by a harder-won loyalty to his own authentic voice, one that would no longer seek validation from sources that had proven unreliable. The professional environment remained unchanged in its daily rhythms and responsibilities, but Marcus now navigated it with the wisdom that comes from understanding the difference between genuine encouragement and polite deflection. The frustration of misplaced trust would eventually give way to the deeper satisfaction of self-reliance, though the journey from disappointment to independence would prove longer and more challenging than any of his early morning poetry sessions had ever been. Sometimes the most valuable learning comes not from success, but from the careful examination of our failures and the courage to build something better from their ashes. The coffee breaks at Henderson's Bakery had transformed from mundane workplace obligations into Marcus's most anticipated moments of each day, 15-minute windows that held the promise of connection and the terror of potential humiliation in equal measure. He'd spend the hours leading up to each break mentally rehearsing conversations, crafting witty observations about the morning's challenges or thoughtful questions about Sarah's weekend plans, only to find his carefully prepared words evaporating the moment he sat across from her in the cramped break room. The professional environment that felt so comfortable during solitary work hours became a stage where his usual confidence abandoned him, leaving behind a nervous energy that made his hands shake and his voice crack, like a teenager asking someone to prom. Sarah, with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed watching others struggle through vulnerable moments, would listen to his stammering attempts at meaningful conversation with an expression that seemed to find his discomfort endearing rather than pathetic. The trust he placed in her reactions became the foundation for a fragile confidence that grew stronger with each successful interaction, each moment where his nervousness was met with kindness rather than judgment. Her consistent gentleness created a safe space where Marcus began to believe that vulnerability might actually be an asset rather than a liability, that his authentic nervous self might be more appealing than any polished persona he could attempt to project. The learning process of accepting his own social awkwardness as potentially charming rather than definitively disqualifying had begun, though he would soon discover how easily such acceptance could be weaponized against him. The ritual of preparation became almost as important as the conversations themselves, with Marcus spending precious minutes before each break practicing casual openings in the bathroom mirror, adjusting his appearance, and rehearsing transitions between topics that might sustain a meaningful dialogue. The frustration of watching his planned conversations derail into nervous rambling was offset by Sarah's consistent positive responses, her way of steering their discussions back on track without making him feel foolish or inadequate. "I think it's adorable how you get nervous," she would say, reaching across the small table to briefly touch his hand, a gesture that sent electricity through his entire nervous system while simultaneously making him even more tongue-tied. Her use of adorable felt like a revelation, reframing his social anxiety as something cute rather than crippling, attractive rather than off-putting. The disappointment he'd felt about his conversational limitations began to fade, replaced by the understanding that Sarah seemed to appreciate authenticity over smooth charm, genuine emotion over polished presentation. Marcus started to see his nervousness as a form of honesty, a way of communicating the depth of his feelings without having to find the perfect words to express them. The professional environment that had once intimidated him with its social complexities now felt like a laboratory where he could experiment with vulnerability and discover its surprising power to create connection. The encouragement Marcus drew from Sarah's positive responses to his nervous energy began to reshape his understanding of attraction, charm, and the ways that genuine emotion can transcend social awkwardness. He'd catch himself approaching their conversations with less preparation and more trust in the moment, allowing his natural reactions to guide the interaction rather than trying to force predetermined outcomes. The loyalty he felt toward Sarah's acceptance of his authentic self became a source of personal growth that extended beyond their workplace interactions, influencing how he navigated social situations with friends, family, and even strangers. Her consistent kindness in the face of his stammering uncertainty created a foundation of trust that made each subsequent conversation feel slightly easier, each moment of connection building upon the last. The learning curve of romantic interaction, which had previously felt impossibly steep, began to level out as Marcus discovered that his perceived weaknesses might actually be strengths in disguise. Sarah's touch, brief and gentle but unmistakably intentional, became the physical confirmation that his emotional transparency was being received as something valuable rather than burdensome. The anticipation of their daily interactions filled him with nervous excitement that felt productive rather than paralyzing, each conversation a small victory in the ongoing campaign to build something meaningful between them. Marcus began to experiment with leaning into his nervousness rather than fighting against it, sharing observations about his own awkwardness that made Sarah laugh and seemed to deepen their connection. "I practiced this conversation 3 times in my head," he'd confess, and somehow it's going completely differently than I planned." Her responses to these moments of self-deprecating honesty were consistently warm and encouraging, creating a dynamic where his vulnerability became a source of mutual amusement rather than personal shame. The professional environment provided the perfect structure for these interactions, with natural conversation starters emerging from shared work experiences and common challenges that gave them plenty to discuss beyond the usual awkward small talk of new relationships. Marcus found himself looking forward to the moments when his nervousness would spike, when Sarah would ask an unexpected question, or when their conversation would venture into more personal territory, because he'd learned that these were the moments when her kindness shone brightest. The trust he placed in her acceptance of his authentic self became the cornerstone of his growing confidence, not just in their relationship, but in his general approach to human connection. The frustration that had previously accompanied social anxiety was being replaced by curiosity about how his genuine reactions might be received, each nervous moment becoming an opportunity for deeper intimacy rather than potential embarrassment. The dynamic they'd established felt sustainable and nurturing, a relationship foundation built on acceptance of imperfection and appreciation for authentic emotion over polished performance. Marcus began to see their interactions as a master class in the power of vulnerability. Each stammering confession or nervous laugh met with Sarah's consistent gentleness and apparent enjoyment of his unguarded moments. The disappointment he'd experienced in previous romantic endeavors, where his nervousness had been treated as something to overcome rather than embrace, seemed like ancient history compared to this new understanding of how attraction could work. Sarah's willingness to find his anxiety adorable rather than annoying gave him permission to stop fighting against his natural reactions and start using them as tools for connection. The learning process of romantic interaction was revealing itself to be less about becoming someone different and more about finding someone who appreciated who he already was, nervousness and all. The professional environment that had once felt like a barrier to personal connection now seemed like the perfect incubator for their growing relationship, providing structure and routine that made their daily interactions feel both significant and sustainable. Marcus began to believe that he'd found not just romantic interest, but someone who could love him for his authentic self rather than despite it. The confidence that grew from Sarah's consistent acceptance of his nervous energy began to influence other areas of Marcus's life, giving him courage to speak up in team meetings, volunteer for responsibilities that required customer interaction, and generally approach his professional duties with less self-consciousness and more authentic engagement. Her validation of his vulnerability had unlocked a version of himself that felt more honest and ultimately more attractive than any persona he'd previously tried to project. The loyalty he felt toward her acceptance became the foundation for a deeper loyalty toward his own authentic expression, creating a positive feedback loop where each genuine interaction reinforced his commitment to emotional honesty. The trust that Sarah had shown in his nervous authenticity felt like a gift that extended far beyond their personal relationship, influencing how he understood the value of being real rather than perfect in all his human connections. The professional environment buzzed with the energy of their growing connection, their colleagues beginning to notice the way they gravitated toward each other during breaks, the way their conversations carried the unmistakable electricity of mutual interest. Marcus felt like he was living in a romantic comedy, where the awkward protagonist finally finds someone who appreciates his endearing quirks, where nervousness becomes charm and authenticity trumps smooth confidence. But the most painful betrayals often come disguised as acceptance, and Marcus was about to learn that what feels like genuine appreciation can sometimes be nothing more than condescending amusement at someone else's expense. The morning that would shatter his understanding of Sarah's adorable comments started like any other, with Marcus approaching their coffee break with his usual mixture of excitement and nervous energy, secure in the knowledge that his anxiety would be met with warmth rather than judgment. He'd prepared a story about a customer interaction that had gone hilariously wrong, confident that Sarah would find both his nervousness during the encounter and his self-deprecating retelling genuinely entertaining. The trust he placed in her consistent kindness felt unshakable as he settled into their usual corner table, ready to once again offer up his vulnerability as a gift to their growing connection. The professional environment hummed with its familiar rhythms, but Marcus moved through the space with the easy confidence that comes from knowing you're accepted exactly as you are, flaws and nervousness and all. Little did he know that he was about to overhear a conversation that would forever change his understanding of the difference between being found adorable and being found amusing, between genuine affection and patronizing tolerance. The learning process he'd embraced so enthusiastically was about to take a devastating turn, one that would teach him that not all acceptance is created equal, and that sometimes what we interpret as love is actually a more complex and far less flattering emotion. The decision to arrive even earlier than his usual pre-dawn schedule had felt like inspiration rather than desperation, Marcus's way of ensuring that his most heartfelt poem yet would be perfectly positioned for Sarah's discovery. 20 minutes before his normal 4:30 a.m. arrival, the bakery stood in complete darkness, its familiar spaces transformed by shadows and silence into something that felt both mysterious and full of possibility. The professional environment that had become his second home took on a different character in these deepest hours of night, when even the most dedicated employees were still hours away, and the building held its breath in anticipation of another day's work. Marcus moved through his extended routine with the careful precision of a man who believed he was crafting the perfect romantic gesture, his hands steady as he positioned the note that represented weeks of growing confidence and deepening hope. The trust he placed in the trajectory of their relationship felt as solid as the brick walls surrounding him, built on a foundation of shared moments, gentle touches, and encouraging words that seemed to point toward something beautiful and lasting. The frustration of his previous romantic failures had been replaced by the steady satisfaction of progress, each day building upon the last, in what felt like a sustainable and meaningful connection. Little did he know that he was about to receive a masterclass in the difference between perception and reality, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truths that exist independent of our hopes and dreams. The poem he'd crafted that morning represented his most vulnerable and ambitious work yet, verses that moved beyond simple observations about bakery life to touch on deeper themes of connection, partnership, and the way certain people can transform ordinary moments into something magical and significant. Marcus had spent hours perfecting each line, reading the words aloud to test their rhythm, ensuring that every metaphor carried the weight of his genuine feelings while maintaining the accessible charm that Sarah seemed to appreciate. The anticipation thrummed through him as he completed his extended preparation routine, the extra 20 minutes feeling like a gift he was giving to their budding relationship, time invested in creating the perfect moment for her daily discovery. The loyalty he felt toward Sarah's consistent encouragement had evolved into something deeper and more personal, a commitment to expressing his authentic feelings regardless of his natural nervousness or social awkwardness. The learning curve of romantic expression through poetry had smoothed into a comfortable practice, each verse becoming both artistic achievement and romantic gesture, two purposes that seemed to strengthen and support each other. The professional environment had become the stage for his most meaningful creative work, the place where his authentic voice had found its first real audience and deepest appreciation. The disappointment that had characterized his previous attempts at connection felt like ancient history compared to this new chapter of mutual understanding and growing intimacy. The extra time allowed Marcus to perfect not just the poem's placement, but the entire morning setup, ensuring that Sarah's coffee would be at the ideal temperature when she arrived, that her workstation would be immaculately prepared, that every detail would communicate the depth of his care without seeming overwhelming or inappropriate. The trust he placed in their established routine felt unshakable as he moved through tasks that had become rituals of devotion, each action carrying meaning that extended far beyond its practical purpose. His confidence had grown to the point where he could imagine Sarah's response before she even arrived, her smile of discovery, her appreciative comments about particularly well-crafted lines, perhaps even the brief touch of her hand that had become the physical manifestation of their connection. The professional environment buzzed with potential energy, even in its pre-dawn silence, as if the building itself was holding space for the romantic drama unfolding within its walls. Marcus felt like a man who had finally found his groove, who had discovered the secret to authentic expression and meaningful connection, who was on the verge of something wonderful and transformative. The frustration of past failures had been replaced by the steady satisfaction of progress, each day confirming his belief that patience, authenticity, and consistent effort could create the foundation for lasting love. But the universe has a way of teaching us that our most cherished assumptions can shatter in an instant, like dropping a tray of delicate pastries on an unforgiving floor. The scene that greeted Marcus as he rounded the corner toward the pastry station would replay in his mind for weeks afterward, each detail etched with the clarity that comes from shock and the desperate need to understand what you're witnessing. Sarah was already there, 20 minutes before her usual arrival time, leaning against the prep counter with an ease that spoke of comfort and familiarity that clearly predated any connection she might have with him. But she wasn't alone, and she wasn't waiting for his poem or preparing for another day of gentle encouragement and adorable nervousness. David, the head pastry chef, stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched, his hand resting casually on her arm, while he whispered something that made her eyes sparkle with the kind of delight that Marcus had hoped was reserved for their interactions. The intimacy of the moment was unmistakable, the natural chemistry that couldn't be manufactured or forced, the easy connection that spoke of shared history and mutual attraction that had nothing to do with morning poems or stammering coffee conversations. The betrayal wasn't dramatic or malicious. There had been no promises broken, no explicit commitments violated. Yet it cut through Marcus with the precision of a baker's blade, swift and clean and devastatingly effective. The learning process he'd thought was about romance and poetry, and the gradual building of meaningful connection, was actually about the harder lesson of recognizing when our feelings aren't reciprocated, when the trust we place in our own perceptions leads us astray. The frozen moment stretched into eternity as Marcus processed the implications of what he was witnessing, his mind struggling to reconcile the scene before him with the narrative he'd been constructing for weeks. Sarah's laugh, the one he'd thought was specifically for him, rang through the quiet space with the same musical quality he'd cherished, but now it was directed towards someone else, someone who clearly held a place in her life that Marcus had never even suspected existed. David's comfortable proximity, the way he touched her arm with casual ownership, the timing of their early morning rendezvous, all of it spoke to a relationship that had been developing parallel to Marcus's hopeful courtship, a connection that made his nervous coffee conversations and carefully crafted poems seem suddenly insignificant and pathetic. The professional environment that had felt so supportive of his romantic endeavors now revealed itself as the stage for a completely different drama, one in which he was not the leading man, but rather an unwitting extra who had confused politeness with interest, kindness with attraction. The trust he'd placed in Sarah's encouragement and acceptance felt like sand slipping through his fingers, every positive interaction recontextualized as professional courtesy rather than personal connection. The disappointment that washed over him was different from simple romantic rejection. It was the deeper pain of discovering that his entire understanding of their relationship had been built on misinterpretation and wishful thinking. The loyalty he'd felt toward their growing connection had been one-sided, his investment in their future together based on signals that had never actually been sent. The retreat was as silent as his approach had been, Marcus backing away from the pastry station with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb a scene that was never meant for his eyes. The poem that had represented his most vulnerable artistic effort remained in his pocket, its verses now feeling like evidence of his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation rather than a gift worthy of sharing. The extra 20 minutes that had seemed like such inspired timing now felt like cruel cosmic joke, the universe's way of ensuring that he would witness the truth rather than continuing to live in his comfortable illusion. The professional environment that had nurtured his confidence and creative voice suddenly felt hostile and unwelcoming, every familiar corner now contaminated with the knowledge of what he'd seen and what it meant for his future interactions with both Sarah and David. The learning process that had felt so positive and growth-oriented revealed itself as an exercise in self-deception, his progress in romantic expression meaningless in the face of the simple fact that his audience was never genuinely interested in what he had to offer. The frustration that replaced his earlier confidence was tinged with embarrassment and self-recrimination, the understanding that he'd been playing a game where the rules were completely different from what he'd imagined. The trust that had felt so solid and reliable crumbled like overproofed dough, leaving behind a mess that would take considerable time and effort to clean up and move past. The morning routine continued with mechanical precision, Marcus moving through his opening duties with the same physical motions but none of the emotional investment that had previously characterized his work. The anticipation that had powered his early arrivals was replaced by a hollow feeling that made every familiar task feel foreign and meaningless. The joy sucked out of routines that had previously felt like expressions of devotion and hope. Sarah's eventual arrival at her normal time would be met with professional courtesy rather than eager anticipation, their interaction stripped of the romantic subtext that had given it meaning and reduced to the simple workplace politeness it had apparently always been. The disappointment would settle into his bones like winter cold, persistent and penetrating, affecting not just his feelings about Sarah, but his broader understanding of his own judgment and ability to read social situations accurately. The betrayal he felt was directed as much toward himself as toward her, the recognition that he'd been complicit in creating a fantasy that had no basis in reality. The professional environment would continue to function exactly as it always had, but Marcus would navigate it with the hard-won wisdom that comes from understanding the difference between professional kindness and personal interest, between politeness and attraction, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truths that exist independent of our hopes and dreams. The end-of-shift ritual at Henderson's Bakery had always been Marcus's least favorite part of the workday, when the controlled chaos of production gave way to the social dynamics of departure, colleagues pairing off for rides home or making plans that highlighted his own solitary routine. The professional environment that felt so welcoming during work hours transformed into something more complicated when personal relationships intersected with workplace logistics, when offers of carpools and shared rides revealed the social hierarchies that existed beneath the surface of professional courtesy. Marcus had grown accustomed to his solo exit, keys jingling as he walked to his aging Honda in the far corner of the parking lot, watching other employees navigate the complex dance of who rode with whom and which invitations were genuine versus merely polite. The trust he'd built in his growing connection with Sarah had begun to include fantasies of shared rides home, conversations that would extend their daily interactions beyond the confines of coffee breaks and work-related discussions. The learning process of workplace romance had taught him to pay attention to these small social cues, to look for opportunities where professional boundaries might soften into something more personal and meaningful. The loyalty he felt toward their developing relationship made every departure feel like a missed opportunity, each day ending with the silent question of whether tonight might be the night she'd need a ride or suggest grabbing dinner together. But sometimes the most devastating lessons come disguised as ordinary moments, routine interactions that reveal truths we weren't prepared to discover. The evening that shattered his remaining illusions started with the usual post-shift cleanup, Marcus methodically working through his closing checklist while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations happening around him, hoping to catch some indication that Sarah might need transportation or be open to extending their time together. The frustration of his morning discovery, witnessing her intimate moment with David, had been temporarily pushed aside by the demands of a busy workday, but it lurked beneath the surface of his consciousness like a persistent headache that no amount of distraction could completely eliminate. The professional environment had required him to maintain normal interactions with both Sarah and David throughout the day, a performance of normalcy that felt increasingly difficult as the hours wore on, and the weight of what he'd seen settled more deeply into his understanding. The disappointment that had initially felt sharp and immediate was evolving into something duller, but more persistent, a steady ache that colored every interaction and made even routine workplace conversations feel hollow and artificial. The learning curve of processing romantic rejection while maintaining professional relationships was proving steeper and more complicated than Marcus had anticipated, requiring emotional skills that his previous experiences hadn't prepared him to develop. The anticipation that had previously made the end of each workday feel full of possibility was replaced by a resigned acceptance that his fantasies of extended time with Sarah were built on foundations that had never been as solid as he'd believed. The sound of Sarah's laughter drew his attention toward the front of the bakery, where she stood near the employee exit with her purse slung over her shoulder, clearly ready to leave but engaged in animated conversation with David about plans that apparently extended beyond their work responsibilities. Marcus found himself moving more slowly through his closing routine, unconsciously timing his tasks to align with their departure while maintaining the pretense of normal end-of-shift duties. The trust he'd once placed in the possibility of romantic development had been damaged, but not completely destroyed. Some stubborn part of his heart still hoping that the morning's scene had been a misunderstanding, or that whatever connection existed between Sarah and David was purely professional rather than personal. The loyalty he felt toward his own feelings made it impossible to simply write off weeks of positive interactions and encouraging moments, even in the face of evidence that suggested his interpretation of those moments had been fundamentally flawed. The professional environment provided cover for his observation, allowing him to witness their interaction without appearing to spy or intrude on conversations that were clearly private. The disappointment he'd experienced that morning was about to deepen as he realized that what he'd witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a glimpse into a relationship dynamic that had been developing right under his nose, hidden in plain sight by his own hopeful blindness to obvious signs. The invitation, when it came, was casual and natural in a way that spoke of established routine rather than spontaneous gesture, David asking Sarah if she was ready to go with the comfortable assumption of someone who knew the answer would be yes. "Ready for our ride," he said, his hand finding the small of her back with the easy familiarity of long practice, guiding her toward the exit with a possessiveness that was gentle but unmistakable. Sarah's response was equally revealing, not the polite acceptance of a professional courtesy, but the comfortable agreement of someone who had been expecting the offer, who saw shared transportation as part of their normal routine rather than a special favor or romantic gesture. The professional environment that had seemed so transparent and straightforward was revealing itself to be full of subtleties and undercurrents that Marcus had completely missed, relationships and dynamics that had been operating parallel to his own hopeful courtship, without his awareness or understanding. The learning process of reading workplace social cues was proving far more complex than he'd realized, his focus on his own developing feelings having blinded him to the broader network of connections and attractions that existed among his colleagues. The frustration that accompanied this realization was directed as much toward his own naivety as toward the situation itself, the recognition that he'd been playing a game where half the players and most of the rules had been invisible to him. The trust he'd placed in his ability to understand and navigate romantic dynamics felt shattered by the evidence of how much he'd missed, how completely he'd misread the social landscape of his own workplace. The moment of departure played out like a scene from someone else's life, Marcus watching from behind the prep counter as David and Sarah moved toward the exit with the synchronized ease of a couple who had walked this path many times before. The wave that Sarah offered in his direction felt like an afterthought, a polite acknowledgement of his presence that carried none of the warmth or significance he might have attributed to it just hours earlier. The pretense of not seeing her gesture was automatic, a protective instinct that allowed him to avoid the awkwardness of responding to what was clearly meant as generic workplace courtesy rather than personal connection. The professional environment that had felt so full of romantic possibility now seemed like a stage where he'd been performing a one-man show, his audience politely tolerating his efforts while being genuinely engaged in completely different dramas. The disappointment that settled over him as he watched their car pull away from the parking lot was different from the sharp shock of the morning's discovery. It was the duller but more persistent pain of understanding that his entire perception of the situation had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. The loyalty he'd felt toward his growing feelings for Sarah was slowly being replaced by a more practical loyalty toward protecting himself from further embarrassment and emotional damage. The learning process that had seemed so positive and growth-oriented was revealing itself as an expensive education in the importance of reading social situations more accurately and investing emotional energy more carefully. The cleanup that followed their departure took on a meditative quality. Marcus moving through familiar tasks with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere, processing the implications of what he'd witnessed and what it meant for his future interactions with both Sarah and David. The trust that had been damaged by the morning's revelation was further eroded by the casual intimacy of their shared ride, the comfortable routine that spoke of a relationship far more established and significant than anything Marcus had been building with his nervous conversations and morning poems. The professional environment that would greet him tomorrow morning would be the same physical space, but his understanding of its social dynamics had been fundamentally altered by the day's discoveries, requiring him to recalibrate his expectations and adjust his behavior accordingly. The frustration of misplaced romantic investment was beginning to give way to the more practical concern of how to maintain professional relationships with people who had unwittingly been part of his emotional miscalculation. The anticipation that had previously made each workday feel full of possibility was being replaced by the more modest goal of navigating his duties without further embarrassment or emotional exposure. The betrayal he felt was softening into something more like disappointment in himself, the recognition that he'd created a romantic narrative where none had actually existed, and that the responsibility for his pain lay as much with his own assumptions as with anyone else's actions. The learning curve ahead would be about rebuilding his confidence and judgment rather than pursuing romantic connection, about understanding the difference between professional kindness and personal interest, about protecting his emotional investments while remaining open to genuine opportunities when they eventually presented themselves. The drive home that night was conducted in silence. Marcus's usual practice of replaying the day's positive interactions replaced by the more sobering exercise of re-examining weeks of memories through the lens of his new understanding, searching for signs he'd missed and clues he'd misinterpreted. The professional environment he'd return to tomorrow would require him to maintain normal working relationships with both Sarah and David, while privately processing the disappointment of discovering that his romantic hopes had been built on a foundation of misunderstood signals and one-sided attraction. The trust he'd need to rebuild was primarily with himself, confidence in his ability to read social situations accurately and invest his emotional energy wisely in future romantic endeavors. The loyalty that had driven his poetry and morning preparations would need to be redirected toward more reliable pursuits, creative expression that didn't depend on external validation or romantic reciprocation for its value and meaning. The learning process ahead would be more challenging but ultimately more valuable than the one he'd thought he was engaged in, teaching him skills that would serve him well beyond the specific disappointment of his unrequited feelings for Sarah. The disappointment would fade with time, but the wisdom gained from this experience would inform his approach to workplace relationships and romantic pursuits for years to come, a costly but necessary education in the complexity of human connection and the importance of building emotional resilience. The absence of ritual can be more deafening than the loudest alarm, and Marcus discovered this truth in the pre-dawn darkness of Henderson's bakery as he moved through his opening routine without the careful preparation that had defined his mornings for weeks. The professional environment that had once buzzed with romantic anticipation now felt hollow and mechanical, each familiar task stripped of the meaning that had transformed mundane duties into acts of devotion and hope. The trust he'd placed in the power of written expression to create connection had been shattered by the previous day's revelations, leaving behind a silence that felt both protective and profoundly empty. His hands worked with automatic precision through the bread preparation, measuring flour and adjusting oven temperatures with the muscle memory of years, but the creative energy that had driven his poetry writing was conspicuously absent, replaced by a focus that was purely practical and deliberately devoid of emotional investment. The learning process that had seemed so promising just days earlier now felt like a cautionary tale about the dangers of misreading social cues and investing romantic hope in professional politeness. The loyalty he'd felt toward expressing his authentic feelings through verse had been replaced by a more practical loyalty toward protecting himself from further exposure and embarrassment. The frustration of unrequited attraction was settling into something deeper and more persistent, a fundamental questioning of his ability to understand human connection and navigate the complex dynamics of workplace relationships. The window that had previously served as inspiration for sunrise metaphors and poetic observations about new beginnings now became simply a source of natural light, its beauty unmarred by the need to translate experience into verse for someone who had never truly been his audience. Marcus found a strange peace in this return to purely functional work, the satisfaction of tasks completed without the additional pressure of crafting perfect moments or creating opportunities for romantic connection. The disappointment that had initially felt overwhelming was beginning to transform into something more manageable, a resigned acceptance that allowed him to appreciate the simple pleasure of work done well without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. The professional environment that had felt so charged with possibility was revealing its more stable qualities, the reliable satisfaction of contributing to something larger than his personal romantic drama, the quiet pride that comes from mastering a craft that serves the community, regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates the individual effort involved. The anticipation that had previously made early mornings feel electric was replaced by a calmer sense of purpose, the understanding that his value as an employee and as a person didn't depend on romantic success or poetic recognition. The learning curve of processing rejection while maintaining professional dignity was proving gentler than expected, his wounded pride finding refuge in the honest satisfaction of work performed with skill and dedication. The trust he was rebuilding was primarily with himself, confidence in his ability to find meaning, and satisfaction independent of external validation or romantic reciprocation. The absence of Sarah's usual coffee preparation ritual felt significant only in its complete ordinariness. Marcus, recognizing that what he'd interpreted as special attention to her needs had probably been nothing more than his own attempt to create intimacy where none had been requested or welcomed. The silence that replaced his morning poetry sessions was filled instead with the authentic sounds of the bakery awakening, ovens cycling through their warm-up sequences, delivery trucks rumbling past on the street outside, the gradual increase in ambient noise as the building prepared for another day of service. The loyalty he now felt was toward these genuine rhythms of productive work, the reliable satisfaction of contributing to something meaningful without the complications of romantic subtext or hidden agendas. The professional environment was revealing its true character as he stopped viewing it through the lens of romantic possibility, showing itself to be a place of honest work and straightforward relationships, where his value was measured by competence and reliability rather than poetic expression or personal charm. The frustration he'd experienced was giving way to a more sustainable form of satisfaction, the understanding that his identity and worth didn't depend on romantic success, but could be built on the solid foundation of craft mastery and professional contribution. The disappointment of his misplaced romantic investment was beginning to feel less like a personal failing and more like a natural part of the learning process that everyone must navigate in the complex landscape of human attraction and workplace relationships. The dawn light streaming through the bakery windows felt cleaner somehow, unmarked by the need to transform every moment into metaphor or every experience into potential verse for an audience that had never been truly listening. The timing of Sarah's eventual arrival registered in Marcus's peripheral awareness, without the heightened attention that had previously marked such moments, her presence becoming simply another element in the normal flow of workplace dynamics, rather than the focal point around which his entire morning had revolved. The trust he was rebuilding with his own judgment included the recognition that his previous interpretation of their interactions had been colored by wishful thinking rather than accurate observation, and that this morning's absence of special preparation was actually a return to appropriate professional boundaries rather than a loss of something that had ever truly existed. The learning process of distinguishing between genuine connection and projected hope was proving more valuable than any romantic success could have been, teaching him skills of emotional self-regulation and realistic assessment that would serve him well in all future relationships. The professional environment hummed with its usual energy as other employees began arriving for their shifts, their interactions unmarked by the dramatic significance that Marcus had been attributing to his own workplace relationships, a reminder that most human connections unfold without the intensity of focus he'd been bringing to every conversation and gesture. The silence that had replaced his morning poetry was revealing itself to be not empty, but full of other sounds and possibilities. The space for different kinds of growth and different forms of satisfaction that didn't depend on external validation or romantic reciprocation. The loyalty he felt toward this new approach was tentative, but growing stronger with each task completed without emotional complication. Each interaction that remained pleasantly professional, without the underlying tension of unspoken romantic agenda. The disappointment was transforming into something more like relief, the understanding that he could find genuine satisfaction in work well done, and authentic relationships that weren't burdened by the weight of unrealistic expectations or misinterpreted signals. The rhythm of bread production provided a meditation that replaced the creative energy he'd previously channeled into verse, the physical satisfaction of kneading and shaping dough, offering a more reliable form of expression than poetry that had depended on an audience who was never truly engaged with his artistic efforts. Marcus discovered that the silence he'd initially experienced as loss was actually creating space for different kinds of awareness, attention to the craft details that had been overshadowed by his romantic preoccupations, appreciation for the genuine community of coworkers that existed independent of any romantic drama or poetic pretensions. The professional environment was revealing its authentic character as he stopped trying to transform it into something it had never been meant to be, showing itself as a place where honest work created genuine satisfaction, and where relationships could develop naturally without the pressure of hidden agendas or unspoken expectations. The trust he was rebuilding included faith in the value of simple competence and reliable contribution, the understanding that his worth as a colleague and as a person could be measured by standards that had nothing to do with romantic success or creative recognition. The learning process was teaching him that disappointment, properly processed, could become wisdom, and that the energy he'd been investing in romantic fantasy could be redirected toward more sustainable forms of personal growth and professional development. The frustration that had initially felt overwhelming was settling into a more manageable acceptance, the recognition that not every attraction needs to be pursued, and not every kindness should be interpreted as romantic interest. The anticipation that had driven his early morning preparations was being replaced by a steadier form of satisfaction, the quiet confidence that comes from understanding your role and performing it well, without needing external validation or recognition to feel worthwhile. The morning light that streamed through the bakery windows as the sun fully rose felt different from the inspirational sunrise that had previously triggered his poetic impulses, cleaner and more honest in its simple beauty that needed no translation into verse or metaphor to be appreciated and valued. The silence that had initially felt like emptiness was revealing itself to be fullness of a different kind, rich with the sounds of productive work and authentic workplace community that didn't depend on romantic subtext for its meaning and significance. Marcus found himself moving through his tasks with a precision that felt both familiar and newly conscious. The satisfaction of work performed well for its own sake, rather than as a stage for romantic performance or creative expression. The professional environment hummed around him with its natural rhythms, colleagues arriving, and beginning their shifts in patterns that had existed long before his romantic drama, and would continue long after his disappointment had faded into memory. The trust he was building with this new approach included confidence in his ability to find genuine satisfaction in honest work and authentic relationships that didn't require the constant effort of interpretation and investment that had characterized his pursuit of Sarah. The loyalty he felt toward this emerging version of himself was tentative, but growing stronger, with each morning that passed without the need to create perfect moments or craft meaningful gestures for an audience that had never truly been present. The learning process was revealing that some of life's most valuable lessons come not from success, but from the careful processing of disappointment, the transformation of romantic failure into personal wisdom that would inform all his future relationships with greater accuracy and appropriate emotional investment. The question, when it finally came, arrived with the casual expectation of someone who had grown accustomed to receiving something without ever questioning whether it was freely given or reluctantly provided. "Where's my note today?" Sarah asked during the morning lull, her tone carrying the light disappointment of someone missing a familiar routine rather than the deeper concern of someone worried about a friend's well-being or creative block. The professional environment that had once felt charged with romantic possibility now revealed itself as simply another workplace where expectations could develop around the smallest gestures, where kindness could be transformed into obligation through repetition and assumption. Marcus paused in his bread shaping, the question hanging in the air between them like flour dust waiting to settle, and felt the weight of all the mornings he'd spent crafting verses for an audience who had never truly been listening. The trust he'd placed in the value of his poetic expression had been fundamentally shaken by his growing understanding of how those expressions had been received, not as gifts of authentic feeling but as amusing diversions to be tolerated rather than treasured. The learning process of distinguishing between genuine appreciation and polite accommodation was about to reach its conclusion with a response that would define the boundaries of their future interactions. The loyalty he'd felt toward honest expression was about to be tested by the need to communicate a difficult truth without causing unnecessary hurt or workplace drama. The frustration that had been building since his morning discovery was crystallizing into a moment of clarity that would require both courage and diplomatic skill to navigate successfully. The response that formed in Marcus's mind carried the weight of weeks of misunderstood intentions and misdirected romantic energy, but it needed to be delivered with the precision of a master baker measuring ingredients for a delicate pastry. "Poem doesn't suit someone who recites for two," he said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the implications of his words before speaking them aloud. The professional environment seemed to hold its breath as the meaning of his statement settled between them, the acknowledgement of knowledge that changed the dynamic of their relationship without creating unnecessary drama or workplace conflict. Sarah's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, understanding, perhaps a hint of embarrassment, as she processed both the content of his response and its implications for what he knew about her relationships and loyalties within their shared workplace. The disappointment that Marcus had been carrying for days was finally finding expression in words that were honest without being cruel, direct without being inflammatory, protective of his own dignity while acknowledging the complexity of human attraction and the impossibility of controlling who we find ourselves drawn to in professional settings. The anticipation that had driven his morning poetry sessions was being formally laid to rest, with a statement that closed one chapter of his emotional life while opening space for whatever might come next. The trust he was rebuilding included confidence in his ability to speak difficult truths with grace and maturity, even when those truths acknowledged painful realities about unrequited feelings and misinterpreted signals. The silence that followed his response felt different from the uncomfortable quiet that sometimes accompanies workplace awkwardness, carrying instead the weight of mutual recognition that their relationship had been operating under false assumptions that needed to be acknowledged and corrected. Marcus returned his attention to his bread shaping with the steady focus of someone who had said what needed to be said, and was prepared to let his words stand without elaboration or apology. The physical rhythm of his work providing a natural conclusion to a conversation that had reached its necessary endpoint. The loyalty he felt toward honest communication was proving stronger than his desire to avoid potentially uncomfortable moments. The understanding that authentic relationships, whether romantic, friendship, or purely professional, required the courage to address misunderstandings rather than allowing them to fester and create ongoing tension. The professional environment resumed its normal flow around them, the brief exchange becoming part of the day's routine rather than a dramatic confrontation that would require extended processing or intervention from management. Sarah's eventual nod of understanding and return to her own tasks carried the grace of someone who recognized that his response, while perhaps unexpected, was both fair and accurate, given the circumstances they had all been navigating. The learning process that had begun with romantic hope was concluding with a form of wisdom that would serve Marcus well in all his future relationships. The ability to recognize when situations weren't developing as he'd hoped, and to respond with dignity rather than bitterness or ongoing pursuit of connection that clearly wasn't mutual. The frustration that had characterized his recent emotional state was beginning to transform into something more like acceptance, the understanding that not every attraction needs to be pursued, and not every disappointment needs to become a source of ongoing conflict or workplace drama. The metaphor embedded in Marcus's response, the idea that poetry doesn't suit someone who recites for two, carried layers of meaning that spoke to his deeper understanding of authenticity, loyalty, and the nature of artistic expression as a form of genuine communication rather than mere entertainment or social lubrication. The trust he'd placed in the power of written words to create connection had been complicated by the discovery that his audience was never fully present, that his verses were being received in a context where competing loyalties made authentic appreciation impossible, or at least significantly compromised. The professional environment had taught him that some gifts, no matter how well-intentioned or skillfully crafted, lose their meaning when offered to people who are already receiving similar offerings from sources that hold greater significance in their emotional lives. The disappointment he'd experienced was being transformed into a more sophisticated understanding of timing, context, and the importance of ensuring that romantic gestures are welcome and appropriate, rather than simply heartfelt and persistent. The learning curve of workplace romance was revealing its most important lesson, that good intentions and authentic feelings, while valuable, are not sufficient to create reciprocal connection when the fundamental dynamic is one-sided, or when competing relationships have already claimed the emotional territory you're hoping to cultivate. The loyalty he'd felt toward expressing his feelings was being refined into a more mature loyalty toward respecting others' choices and emotional commitments, even when those choices didn't align with his own hopes and preferences. The anticipation that had driven his creative efforts was being replaced by a calmer acceptance of what was actually possible within the constraints of their professional relationship and personal circumstances. The aftermath of his statement created space for both Marcus and Sarah to recalibrate their interactions around more realistic expectations and appropriate boundaries, the brief exchange serving as a diplomatic resolution to a situation that could have become significantly more complicated if left unaddressed. The professional environment benefited from this moment of honest communication, the reduction of underlying tension that had been affecting their work dynamic, even when neither of them had been fully conscious of its impact on their daily interactions. Marcus found that speaking his truth, even when it acknowledged disappointment and closed off romantic possibilities, created a sense of relief and renewed focus that made his work more satisfying and his relationships more authentic. The trust he was rebuilding included confidence in his ability to handle difficult conversations with grace and maturity, skills that would serve him well in all areas of his professional and personal life, regardless of whether future romantic opportunities developed within his workplace or elsewhere. The learning process that had begun with hope and progressed through disappointment was concluding with wisdom about the importance of honest communication, appropriate boundaries, and the value of relationships that are built on mutual understanding, rather than one-sided projection and assumption. The loyalty he felt toward this new approach was strengthening with each interaction that felt more genuine and less burdened by hidden agendas or unspoken expectations, the satisfaction of authentic professional relationships that didn't require constant emotional management or careful interpretation of every gesture and word. The frustration that had driven his romantic pursuit was being channeled into more productive outlets, creative expression that didn't depend on external validation and professional relationships that were valued for their own qualities rather than their potential for romantic development. The bread that Marcus shaped that morning carried none of the romantic symbolism that had previously infused his work with additional meaning, but it possessed a different kind of satisfaction, the honest pleasure of craft mastery and community service that didn't require external validation to feel worthwhile and significant. The silence between him and Sarah as they worked in their respective areas felt comfortable, rather than charged, the resolution of their brief exchange having cleared the air in ways that made genuine professional friendship possible, without the complications of unspoken romantic tension or mismatched expectations. The professional environment hummed with its normal rhythms, their colleagues unaware that a small but significant drama had been resolved through honest communication rather than escalating into workplace conflict or ongoing awkwardness. The trust that Marcus was building with this experience included faith in the value of direct communication, even when it involves acknowledging uncomfortable truths about unrequited feelings and misinterpreted signals that had shaped weeks of emotional investment and creative effort. The learning process was revealing that some of life's most valuable growth comes not from romantic success, but from the development of emotional maturity and communication skills that serve all relationships, the ability to handle disappointment with grace, and to maintain professional relationships, even when personal hopes don't align with reality. The loyalty he felt toward his evolving understanding of authentic connection was proving more reliable than his previous loyalty toward romantic fantasy, creating a foundation for future relationships that would be built on mutual interest and realistic assessment rather than projection and wishful thinking. The anticipation that had previously focused on romantic possibilities was being redirected toward more sustainable sources of satisfaction, professional growth, and creative expression that didn't depend on reciprocal feelings or external appreciation to maintain their value and significance in his daily life. The weeks that followed Marcus's quiet declaration had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and fundamentally different. The professional environment at Henderson's Bakery returning to its natural state without the undercurrent of romantic tension that had previously charged even the most mundane interactions. The trust that Marcus had been rebuilding with himself was strengthening daily, his confidence growing not from external validation, but from the steady satisfaction of work performed well and relationships maintained with appropriate boundaries and realistic expectations. The learning process that had begun with romantic hope and progressed through disappointment was maturing into something more valuable, the wisdom to distinguish between genuine connection and projected fantasy, between mutual interest and one-sided attraction that mistakes politeness for encouragement. Sarah's attempts at reapproaching him had been subtle at first. Lingering glances during team meetings, casual questions about his weekend plans, comments about missing the creative energy that had previously characterized their morning interactions. The loyalty Marcus felt toward his new understanding of authentic communication required him to navigate these overtures with diplomatic grace while maintaining the boundaries he'd established for his own emotional protection. The frustration that had initially accompanied his romantic disappointment had evolved into a more mature appreciation for the complexity of human attraction and the importance of timing, context, and mutual investment in any meaningful relationship. The anticipation that had once focused entirely on romantic possibilities was being channeled into more sustainable pursuits, creative expression that didn't depend on external audience and professional relationships that were valued for their own qualities rather than their potential for romantic development. The morning when Sarah's reapproach became direct rather than subtle marked a turning point that would test Marcus's commitment to the boundaries he'd established and the wisdom he'd been cultivating through weeks of careful self-reflection and emotional recalibration. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began during a quiet moment in the prep area, her voice carrying a tentative quality that suggested genuine uncertainty about how her words would be received. "About the poetry and everything. I wonder if maybe we could start fresh somehow." The professional environment seemed to hold its breath as Marcus considered his response, the weight of history and the knowledge of current realities creating a complex emotional landscape that required careful navigation. The disappointment he'd experienced weeks earlier had been processed and integrated into a broader understanding of his own patterns and needs, leaving him capable of responding with clarity rather than reactiveness. The trust he'd rebuilt included confidence in his ability to make decisions based on realistic assessment rather than wishful thinking, to value his own emotional well-being alongside consideration for others' feelings and workplace harmony. The learning curve he'd been navigating was about to present its final examination, the test of whether he could maintain his newly established boundaries when faced with the possibility that his original hopes might not have been entirely misplaced. The loyalty he felt toward his own growth and understanding would need to be balanced against the natural human tendency to reopen doors that had been carefully closed for good reason. Marcus's response, when it came, carried the weight of all his recent learning about authenticity, timing, and the nature of genuine versus convenient connection, his words carefully chosen to communicate respect for Sarah, while maintaining the emotional boundaries that had proven necessary for his own well-being. Versus delivery, he said with the calm certainty of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the metaphors that governed his approach to relationships and creative expression. And I stopped making deliveries without orders. The professional environment absorbed his words with the same steady rhythm that had characterized all their interactions since his earlier declaration, the statement landing with the precision of someone who understood both the power of language and the importance of clear communication in complex interpersonal situations. Sarah's expression shifted through recognition and perhaps a hint of respect for the consistency of his position, the understanding that his boundaries weren't arbitrary reactions, but carefully considered decisions based on experience and self-knowledge. The anticipation that had once driven Marcus toward romantic pursuit was being channeled into the satisfaction of maintaining integrity and authentic self-expression, even when doing so required declining opportunities that might have seemed appealing on the surface. The frustration that had characterized his earlier emotional state had been replaced by a more stable sense of personal agency, the confidence that comes from understanding your own needs and being willing to protect them even in the face of social pressure or renewed romantic possibility. The learning process that had begun with hope and progressed through disappointment was reaching its mature conclusion with the demonstration of emotional wisdom and practical self-care. The metaphor that Marcus had chosen, comparing poetry to delivery service, spoke to his deeper understanding of creative expression as a form of communication that requires genuine request and appreciation rather than imposed offering, no matter how well-intentioned or skillfully crafted. The trust he'd placed in the value of his artistic voice had been refined through experience into a more discriminating approach that honored both his creative energy and the autonomy of potential audiences to choose their own sources of inspiration and connection. The professional environment had taught him that some gifts, regardless of their quality or the sincerity of their creation, become burdens when offered repeatedly to recipients who haven't explicitly requested them or demonstrated genuine appreciation for their value. The disappointment he'd experienced had been transformed into wisdom about the importance of mutual investment in any meaningful exchange, whether romantic, artistic, or purely professional. The loyalty he felt toward his own creative expression now included protection of that expression from contexts where it couldn't be received with the attention and respect it deserved, the understanding that authentic art requires authentic audience rather than captive or merely polite recipients. The learning curve of artistic sharing had revealed its most important lesson, that the value of creative work is best preserved by offering it only to those who have demonstrated genuine interest and appreciation, rather than broadcasting it indiscriminately in hopes of eventual recognition or romantic connection. The anticipation that had previously focused on external validation was being redirected toward internal satisfaction and the development of creative skills that didn't depend on particular audiences for their worth and significance. Sarah's response to his statement revealed the grace that can emerge when difficult conversations are handled with honesty and mutual respect. Her nod of understanding, acknowledging both the validity of his position and the complexity of the situation they had all been navigating within their shared professional environment. "I understand," she said simply, her voice carrying acceptance rather than argument or attempts at persuasion that might have created ongoing workplace tension or awkwardness. The professional environment seemed to exhale around them as the conversation reached its natural conclusion, the brief exchange serving to close a chapter that had remained partially open despite Marcus's earlier declaration of boundaries. The trust that had been rebuilt through weeks of careful emotional work was validated by this moment of clear communication and mutual respect, the demonstration that difficult interpersonal situations could be resolved through honesty rather than avoidance or escalating conflict. The learning process that had encompassed romantic disappointment, professional boundary setting, and artistic self-respect was reaching completion with this final affirmation of personal agency and authentic communication. The loyalty Marcus felt toward his own growth and understanding was strengthened by the evidence that maintaining boundaries didn't require cruelty or ongoing conflict, that it was possible to protect one's emotional well-being while maintaining professional relationships and workplace harmony. The frustration that had initially characterized his emotional journey was being replaced by satisfaction with his ability to navigate complex situations with dignity and clarity, skills that would serve him well in all future relationships, regardless of their romantic or professional nature. The weeks that followed this final exchange settled into a rhythm that felt both peaceful and productive, the professional environment returning to its natural state without the undercurrent of unresolved romantic tension or unexpressed hopes that had previously complicated even routine interactions. Marcus found himself approaching his work with renewed focus and creativity, his artistic energy no longer channeled toward romantic pursuit, but directed instead toward personal expression and professional excellence that didn't depend on external validation for their value and satisfaction. The trust he'd rebuilt included confidence in his ability to recognize and maintain appropriate boundaries, while remaining open to genuine opportunities for connection and collaboration that might develop naturally within his professional and personal circles. The learning process that had begun with hope and progressed through disappointment had concluded with wisdom that would inform all his future relationships, the understanding that authentic connection requires mutual investment and that the most meaningful creative expression comes from internal motivation rather than external pressure or romantic agenda. The loyalty he felt toward this evolved approach was reinforced daily by the satisfaction of work performed with integrity and relationships maintained with honesty and appropriate expectations. The anticipation that had once focused on romantic possibilities was being channeled toward more sustainable sources of fulfillment, professional growth, and creative development that would continue to provide satisfaction regardless of whether future romantic opportunities developed within his workplace or elsewhere. The disappointment that had initially felt devastating had been transformed into one of the most valuable learning experiences of his adult life, teaching him skills of emotional regulation, boundary maintenance, and authentic communication that would serve him well in all areas of his personal and professional development. The professional environment of Henderson's Bakery hummed around him with its natural rhythms, a place where honest work created genuine satisfaction and where relationships could develop organically without the pressure of hidden agendas or unrealistic expectations that had previously complicated his daily experience and emotional well-being. Take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because mastering the delicate balance of professional relationships while protecting your emotional well-being is a skill that will serve you throughout your entire career. And there's so much more to explore about building genuine success in environments where human nature, ambition, and authentic connection create both the greatest opportunities and the most challenging obstacles you'll ever face.